This house is now mine. There's no room for you, Rachel, so get out already. My mother-in-law cheerfully shouted, leaving my husband Bob and I stunned. Returning home to our apartment in the city after successfully giving birth back in my hometown, we found the door unlocked. Fearing that an intruder might have gotten in, we entered cautiously, only to be greeted by my mother-in-law, drinking tea in the living room and making her bold declaration. My name is Rachel. I met Bob at a social gathering and later we got married. From the start, my mother-in-law didn't seem to like the fact that Bob and I had met at such an event. A woman who attends such a scandalous event will never be my daughter-in-law, she muttered from the moment we first met. But I silenced her with a smile, saying, "But Bob also attended that scandalous gathering, you know." Of course, the event Bob and I attended was nothing scandalous. It was hosted by our colleagues from work. My mother-in-law, a single mother, raised Bob with great care. So it seemed that she was truly sad when Bob moved out to get married. That seemed to be the reason she was always picking on me. My strong heart prevented her attacks from working. My mother-in-law frequently invaded our home, deliberately taking the train over without an appointment. As a salaried worker who only goes into the office about once a week and works from home the rest of the time, I couldn't ignore her persistent doorbell ringing and door knocking, especially considering the nuisance for the neighbors. Bob, whose job requires him to go in every day, is not at home during the day. My mother-in-law, calculating the time when her beloved son Bob isn't around, comes to our house and constantly complains to me. She complains about dishes piling up in the sink, about the laundry accumulating. She goes through every room without hesitation. And when she comes over and complains whenever she sees household chores being done casually. Then, as if it were her catchphrase, she would sigh, "Poor Bob, to have such a wife. I should have raised him to hold such a much higher standard for women." As for Bob, who she pities, he really loves me, which is a disappointment to my mother-in-law. Originally, I preferred older, dapper men, but Bob, who is 3 years younger than me, pursued me fervently, which led us to dating and eventually marrying. So when my mother-in-law picks on me, Bob gets very angry. I always reported to Bob what my mother-in-law said, so each time Bob would call her saying, "Mom, it's a hassle when you come without calling. Rachel isn't just hanging around at home, she's working." Well, even so, my mother-in-law never stopped coming unannounced, and instead, she often snapped at me saying, "Why did you tell Bob?" Even before giving birth, I got used to my mother-in-law's unannounced visits and complaints about housework, and no longer directly confronted her complaints. Without taking my eyes off the computer screen, I casually responded to all my mother-in-law's complaints with, I'm sorry, I'll do it next time." Despite my attitude, I felt sorry for my mother-in-law, who is desperately trying to torment her daughter-in-law. Bob and I shared the housework, and I didn't care about the complaints from my mother-in-law. I didn't think much of it, saying, she's at it again." But the words she said when I reported my pregnancy were really harsh. "You're pregnant? Whose child is it?" Bob and I hugged each other in joy. He was so eager that he was already stroking my flat belly, saying, "I can't wait to meet the baby." And yet, my mother-in-law seemed to think that I had made a child with another man. "Huh?" I instinctively responded, to which my mother-in-law continued with an angry expression. "You've betrayed Bob and made a child with another man, haven't you? After all, you're unattractive and 3 years older than Bob. A woman like you and my Bob couldn't possibly have a child." In response to my mother-in-law's confident statement, I blew up. "That's impossible! Please go home!" When I said that, my mother-in-law left the house laughing and saying, "See, you're angry because I hit the nail on the head. I'm going to report this to Bob." As she promised, my mother-in-law seems to have told Bob that Rachel is trying to make you raise a child from another man. But Bob cut off her argument with a simple, "That's impossible. Rachel would never hurt me." Bob, who said this with a laugh, was truly kind, and I was sincerely glad to be married to him. Several months had passed since I found out I was pregnant. I had returned to my childhood home to prepare for the birth. My family's home is quite far from Bob's office, so he usually stays behind at our apartment. I miss you when you're not home, Rachel. Bob would say this, and while I thought it was sweet, I took the opportunity to spend some quality time with my parents at my family home. Then came the day I gave birth. As soon as my mother informed Bob that I was in labor, he immediately took time off work and hurried over. Seeing me in pain, Bob held my hand and, looking like he was about to cry, said, "I wish I could take your place." I think I was delirious from the pain because I yelled back, "Then do it!" "Sorry, Rachel, I can't." Of course he refused, but Bob encouraged me through my labor, and I finally gave birth to our baby. When they handed me our tiny newborn, I felt a warmth well up inside me. Was this what it meant to be a mother? I was so moved. I cried. Bob was also deeply moved and repeatedly thanked me. We named our son Jacob and spent a few peaceful days at my family's home while we settled into our new roles as parents. Having a baby completely changed our daily rhythm, and there were many challenging aspects. But I believed that we could overcome anything as long as we were together. But when we returned to our apartment in the high-rise, we found the door unlocked and my mother-in-law drinking tea in the living room. Even though she always acted as if the apartment was hers, I had no idea why she was in our home. "Bob, did you give your mom a key?" "No, I didn't." When I quietly asked Bob, he vehemently shook his head in denial. Upon seeing this, my mother-in-law snorted and showed us a key she had placed on the table. "I saw the key hanging at the entrance, so I borrowed it to make a copy." Indeed, we had a key hook at our entrance and would leave our key there, but I never thought my mother-in-law would steal it and make a copy. I was taken aback by her audacity. Seeming pleased with herself, my mother-in-law finally noticed Jacob in Bob's arms and stood up. "Well," my mother-in-law smiled as she looked at Jacob's face. Then she spoke to Bob. "Isn't that Rachel's child with some unknown man, Bob? You don't need to hold him. You're not the victim here. Just go home with me, Bob. You don't need to have anything to do with a woman like Rachel." "You're still saying that? This is our child. I don't mind if you have a DNA test done." "Why should I have to do that? It's obvious when you look at him. The baby is ugly. Just like Rachel. He looks nothing like my handsome Bob." As she said this, my mother-in-law looked from Jacob to Bob. Then, seeing the look on Bob's face, she froze. Bob was glaring at her, a furious expression on his face. "Bob, I've always told you not to come to our place without asking, and not to say mean things to Rachel, and yet you've made a duplicate key, and you've come here? What is this?" "I was just trying to protect you." "What you're doing is not protecting me. All you've done is cause trouble for me. Rachel and Jacob are not ugly. Rachel is beautiful, and Jacob has a cute face. Don't insult my family." "Your family is supposed to be me, right?" In response to his mother's shaky question, Bob calmly replied, "My family is Rachel and Jacob." While my mother-in-law was frozen in shock, I gathered up our valuables. "Let's go somewhere else, Bob. Your mom seems to think this is her place." "Where are you going?" To my mother-in-law's shrill question, I cheerfully replied, "That's none of your business. You said there's no place for me here, and I have work to do. So, we're moving. Goodbye." And with that, Bob and I left the apartment. As we left, Bob asked, "What should we do? Change the locks?" But considering that we were about to start raising Jacob, I didn't think I could stand living in a place where my mother-in-law could drop in unannounced every day. No, let's move. We'll sell that house for now. We might just rent a weekly apartment. Upon agreeing with my proposal, Bob and I temporarily moved into a weekly apartment. During that time, Bob and I rented an apartment in a new condominium, and so we began moving out of the house my mother-in-law insisted was hers. She truly seemed to believe she could occupy the room in the tower residence where we used to live, and showed a confused expression when I let the movers in, exclaiming, "What's going on?" "This room you might think is yours, mother-in-law, but it's a house that Bob and I bought. The ownership of this house is Bob's, so you don't have any legal ownership, mother-in-law. Bob has decided to sell this house, so it would be better for you to find a new house soon." I said this while holding Jacob. Watching Bob give brisk instructions to the movers, my mother-in-law turned pale. Because she could just return to her original house, I was wondering why she was so panicked. But my mother-in-law answered my question with her next words. I have nowhere else to live but this house. I have already terminated the contract for my previous house. The apartment where my mother-in-law lived was a rental. I was surprised that she had terminated the rental contract to live in this room. Bob, who had been listening to the conversation from a distance, was also surprised. My mother-in-law begged Bob and me, saying, "Please let me live in the house." But Bob didn't allow it. As a final act of filial piety, Bob gave my mother-in-law a little money and told her, "You should be able to get back on your feet if you rent a room with that money." Still unable to bear the fact that she was being abandoned by her adorable son Bob, my mother-in-law clung to him, crying, "Where will you live, Bob? I'm lonely. Please live with me." But there was no way Bob would allow this. I told you over and over again to stop bullying Rachel, but you didn't stop, Mom. I appreciate that you raised me, but I wanted you to be happy that I've become independent and have a family. You relied too much on me, Mom. I think it's better for both of us if we never see each other again. At Bob's words, my mother-in-law collapsed in tears, saying, "No way!" But Bob's determination did not waver. Of course, since I didn't tell her the address of our new apartment, mother-in-law could no longer come uninvited. Thinking, I won't have to see my mother-in-law anymore. What a great relief. On the night we completed the move, my mother-in-law, who seemed to have calmed down, called Bob and I numerous times. Busy taking care of Jacob, I hadn't paid attention to my smartphone and was startled to see the large number of missed calls late at night, so I set it to reject her calls. As her only son, Bob couldn't completely abandon his mom and took her calls for a while. But every time Bob answered the phone, she began to spew insults about me. She even said that Bob was being brainwashed by me, and Bob seemed to be fed up with the phone ringing at all hours of the day and night. Even kind and patient Bob seemed to be at the end of his tether as these days continued. Mom, I've tried not to abandon you because you are my mother and you raised me with care, but I'm at a limit. Despite my repeated warnings, you won't stop bad-mouthing Rachel. And I don't think you'll ever change, Mom. I won't answer the phone anymore. But I hope you can forgive me. Bob seemed to feel a great deal of guilt for abandoning his own mother, but he would break down if he had to listen to his wife being bad-mouthed every day. Having received the declaration of severance, my mother-in-law was crying on the other side of the phone. But Bob firmly cut off all ties with her since then. Despite Bob, the landlord, telling her to leave within a week, my mother-in-law refused and continued to live in the empty room. Confused by my mother-in-law's refusal to leave, we consulted a lawyer. When we conveyed through the lawyer that we might end up suing her, it seems my mother-in-law finally left the house. We don't know what kind of life my mother-in-law has been leading since then, but she had been receiving financial support from Bob, so now that that's gone, I think she must be living a financially strained life. On the other hand, Bob, Jacob, and myself are living a peaceful life in our newly purchased home. We were relieved when a new tenant quickly bought the room in the tower residence that we had decided to give up. Bob has taken paternity leave, so I'm not struggling with single-handedly raising our child. I can raise Jacob calmly and peacefully. You're always working so hard, so I'll pick up the slack with the house chores during my paternity leave, Bob said, who has been taking the lead in doing housework. Honestly, Bob is such a wonderful husband that I feel he's too good for me. Even when we had to deal with taking over my mother-in-law's house, I'm truly grateful to Bob who stood with me through that ordeal. Recently, Jacob has learned to crawl and has been exploring the house. I spend my days smiling as I watch him with Bob.